Aha! We are here. A mere almost 40 minutes after I started the stream. Hey, sometimes you get wrapped up setting up for a birthday party. It happens. But anyway, we are getting started a little late today, as you guys have gleaned. This is normally a morning show at 10:30-ish show. Getting started a little late today because we had a few things going on this morning here at HSC, a couple birthday parties, a couple demos that had to get done, but we're still getting it done. A little bit of an after-lunch program today. But we are, of course, today continuing our series that we've been doing over the last several weeks, where we are highlighting different species of fish that can be found in Minnesota's lakes, rivers, streams, etc., Minnesota's waters. And so most of what we've done so far has been a lot of sort of sport fish. Sort of the angle that I'm supposed to take with these shows is talking about fish that you can find in Minnesota waters with the expectation of like, hey, let's teach people how to fish for these things. Let's talk a little bit about fishing and have people be a little bit more successful with their fishing under the hope that we'll, cater a new generation of young anglers that are going to go out and enjoy Minnesota's waters kind of any way they can. And then if they're out there in nature, enjoying nature, they'll be more likely to become good stewards of nature once they become adults, is sort of the gimmick of this whole thing here. So this is a program and a series of talks, lectures, demos, whatever we want to call this, that have been funded to the Headwaters Science Center through the Mississippi Audubon Society, the Audubon Society, via the No Kid Left Inside grant, which I think is a state level one. Don't quote me on that though. But anyway, today we're talking about a little bit kind of different group of fishes. These are fish that are legal to fish for in Minnesota waters. But honestly, we're talking about three species that a lot of people who even do a lot of angling maybe have rarely, if ever, caught here in Minnesota. And particularly sort of the through line with these three is they're all fish that, in my experience, a lot of times get framed as being very primitive, very sort of prehistoric type of vibe. When people are talking about these types of fish, that tends to be the type of language they use, is how, I said, sort of primitive they are. And I want to talk a little bit about that, sort of why that is and why that applies sort of these particular fish, or maybe how it doesn't apply to these particular fish. But like I said, these are going to be a bunch of species that you can, in fact, fish for if you feel so inclined in Minnesota. All right. And so the species we're going to be talking about today primarily are the lake sturgeon, the common bowfin, the long-nosed gar, and the short-nosed gar. And like I said, four species that have some relatively large footprint in here. Some other species that would maybe fit in with this. The paddlefish would be a great example of a fish that sort of fits in with this sort of group too. I thought about talking about paddlefish. I decided not to because it's not actually legal to target paddlefish while fishing because they are a very much an endangered species. We also barely have them in Minnesota. But they're another species that could fit in this. We actually have another species of sturgeon you can find in Minnesota too, the shovel-nosed sturgeon. But again, they're not terrifically common in Minnesota, so I decided to skip them for the purposes of this. And so, when I talk about these fish and sort of what the sort of through line is of them, most fish fit into a group called the teleosts or teleosts. And that includes literally every species we've talked about so far. And when you're talking about teleosts, it represents, I want to say it's 95+% of all species of fish fit into this group. And sort of the through line, the feature that sort of defines what a teleost is their ability to sort of project their mouth out. This is not a Minnesota fish, this is some ocean fish, but it's really demonstrating well this specific feature that teleost fish have, which is to sort of project their mouth out forward. They have a very specific way that their jaw is built that lets them sort of open up their mouth in such a way that projects the mouth out forward and allows for different types of feeding, basically. We've talked about how a lot of fish, what they do is they basically project their mouth out, open it up real wide, and suck a bunch of water in. Being able to project your jaw out like that is something that really helps facilitate that. And so teleos can do this, non-teleos mostly can't. Some of them do have mouths that sort of project out in similar ways, but it's through different types of structures than the way the teleos do. It's not a skeletal thing. So sturgeon, I guess, specifically is what I'm talking about. If you ever catch sturgeon, they have a mouth that is on the bottom and will very much sort of project out. I've even heard people call them like trunks that they have, where when you can pull their mouth out and it's sort of this big tube that comes out. But like I said, structurally different, evolutionarily not particularly related. And so, when we're talking about these non-teleos, really what we're doing is we're talking about a group of fish that are less closely related to all the other fish around them than other fish are. So like a bluegill and a muskie like look very different from one another, act very different from one another, but they're more closely related to each other than either of them are to something like a sturgeon, basically, or something like a bowfin, where even though the bowfin might like behaviorally be more similar to the muskie than the bluegill is, genetically, when you're talking about these relationships, a muskie and a bluegill are more closely related than a muskie and a bowfin are. An important distinction, though, is just because that they are less closely related to the other Minnesota fish than the other Minnesota fish are to one another, it doesn't necessarily mean that every fish in this group is like supremely closely related to one another. Basically, I'm trying to picture it right now. So like, I want to say it's gar in particular are not super closely related to the other ones that we're going to talk about today. They just represent sort of a different branch that diversified away at a different time. Whereas the sturgeon and the bowfin and paddlefish are to some extent relatively closely related. Another great example of this, another non-teleosed fish that we have in Minnesota that you guys probably have encountered, at least on some level, probably at least seen the evidence of, are lampreys. And so lampreys are a great example of, you'd say that's a non-teleosed fish, but it's also a fish that is not closely related to, it's not any more closely related to like a sturgeon than it is to a muskie. It gets a little complicated. Maybe that's a different discussion for a different time. Actually kind of similar to a discussion I did in one of these shows that I didn't live stream, so maybe I can just go find that PowerPoint presented again to our live stream audience. We are open today, but I don't actually have a live audience today, as it would turn out. Someone might wander in, but it's just you and me today, internet. So yeah, these are our non-teleos sort of game fish we have in Minnesota, basically. And we're going to start with one that is maybe, arguably my favorite of this bunch, the common bowfin. This is also probably the one that you are most likely to encounter like by accident when you're out fishing, because they're pretty common throughout lakes all over Minnesota. I've caught them just like casting for other stuff before. I've caught them when I'm fishing for northerns on a number of occasions. I've even caught them off the dock on a handful of occasions. But they are an interesting fish, and like I said, one of my favorite fish, because I have a certain soft spot for fish that are not well liked by other people. Like, I have a soft spot for fish that are sort of considered to be, ugly or dirty or, whatever in a way that, like I said, generally makes them considered to be not desirable. And these guys are a great example of, that exact type of fish, where a lot of the times these guys get like, that various times in history have been like actively targeted and killed just because, like I said, they've been considered sort of a pest fish and a dirty fish that people just don't want to have around. And so they are a species that can be a very aggressive predator. And in particular, that sort of is what has largely gotten them in trouble, is they have that really unfortunate combination of their meat generally isn't considered to be very tasty, and they're very much a predator. And so you combine those two things, and all of a sudden they fall into that trap that we've talked about on a number of occasions already at this point, where people will say, ooh, they're bad for walleye populations. And so, like I said, they get targeted and killed for that reason. But it's a fish that it's pretty easy to identify when you see it. The sort of very signature traits that you're looking for on them are this really like rounded tail. Most fish that we've talked about so far have had a tail that is what we call heterocaudal or heterocaudal or what's the one where it's even on both sides? I don't know. Most fish that I've talked about have sort of had a tail that's sort of forked, where there's a top and there's a bottom and there's sort of a narrow part in between. Dogfish, another name for these guys, the common bowfin has this nice round sort of like spatula-shaped tail almost at the end, with this really distinct spot on the tail as well, this dark spot. They all have that. That's probably like the single easiest thing to look for when you're looking at these guys is if they have that big spot in the round tail, that's a bowfin. The thing they're named after, though, and another unique feature, is their dorsal fin. And so they have this unique dorsal fin that is basically one continuous piece with just some rays in it, but it starts, about a little less than halfway down their back and goes all the way down to their tail as sort of one continuous thing. And when you see these guys sitting in the water, they sort of will undulate that whole fin sort of back and forth, and it's a way that they, when they're moving kind of slowly, like I said, you can catch them in the shallows every once in a while, and you'll see them swimming around in there, and they're not even hardly getting like their tail or their other fins involved at all. They're just using that dorsal fin and sort of almost like snake-like sort of slithering around in the water. Similar to their sort of big round tail, they also have big round heads that you can't quite exactly see on this image very clearly, but their head is very similar shape, sort of like the tail just flipped sideways. And the really like distinct feature of them, like head-wise, is one, it's really bony and hard and heavy, their head. They also have a really, really strong bite. So that's one thing to like be careful if you are catching these guys or targeting these guys to go catching, is be prepared for that, bring some gloves, because they can bite hard, I will tell you. And they are predominantly a species that is hanging out mostly on the bottom. Like I said, you can find them in relatively shallow water. I know in other places, I've never tried this, but I know people who do like specifically fish for them. A lot of times they'll go into sort of swampy areas and fish for them, where the water is only, a couple feet deep, basically. They feed really heavily on fish. They love to eat things like crayfish and stuff like that as well, but they're also a unique species of fish in that they'll actually eat a lot of what we call carrion. So stuff that dies and sinks to the bottom, they'll come up and they'll eat that type of stuff too, pretty readily. And I assume that's probably part of the reason why they get found around like fishing docks a lot of the times, because there's probably a lot of dead fish that sink to the bottom there from people catching and releasing. You can see sort of that little bit of a round head that they have there in this picture here. And again, the big round tail with the spot near it. They're predominantly like a night fish. Like when I think about times when I've caught them, especially if I've like seen them in the shallows around the docks, it's almost always like, I'm going out after dinner to, go just cast a line off the dock for a couple hours, like until I can't see anymore, basically. That's when you really are likely to start spotting them around the dock, in my experience. I've know some people claim that they have like really bad vision. Basically, I can't speak to that necessarily. I wasn't able to find any like particularly like good information on their vision. There's not a lot of information about how to fish for these guys, like specifically, because very, very few people do it. But yeah, generally, like the sort of common wisdom on them is that they don't have very good vision. They are predominantly like a scent-based predator, and so when you're fishing for them, you generally aren't looking for, like we talked about with like walleyes and northerns, how you're getting all this like reflective stuff and glowy stuff and bright patterns and all that. When you're fishing for bowfin, sort of the common wisdom is that you're using stuff that is going to be really easily detectable, primarily by sense of smell, basically. And so you'll hear people use a lot of cut bait for them, which cut bait is usually like it's generally going to be like dead fish and stuff like that you're cutting up into pieces. It's almost like chumming, basically, but you catch a bluegill, you cut it into pieces, and you use the chunks of the bluegill for your fishing, is sort of what you'd use. So it's very similar type of stuff to what you'd use for like catfishing, basically. Stuff like worms and leeches and stuff like that works for them also. The problem that you're going to run into using stuff like that is you're going to probably end up spending a lot more time chasing, bluegills and rock bass off of your line than you are going to actually be catching bowfin. So yeah, but if you're using like a relatively large, just sort of hunk of meat or whatever, you're probably going to be more likely to catch these guys and, like I said, have fewer issues as far as, like I said, getting the panfish off of your bait. Make sure you're bringing heavy line, heavy tackle with you. Like I said, I've caught these guys by accident before while I'm fishing for northerns, and I remember the first one I ever caught was in Little J. Gould over by Grand Rapids, Cohasset area. We were casting for northerns in Little J. Gould, so I was throwing a spoon, a daredevil, and it hit my spoon, and I fought it for a while, assuming I had just a pretty decent sized northern on, and I pulled it in and was like, what is this thing? I've never seen this before. And my dad knew what it was, though, because he had caught him before. And we pulled it out and brought it in and, got its jaws open and pulled the spoon out of there, and it had curled my spoon up pretty much in half, like had completely folded it over on itself, like it was just a broken bait that I couldn't use anymore after that. And so, like I said, be prepared for stuff to get damaged. Like I said, make sure that you're watching your fingers and stuff when you're biting these guys, because like I said, they can bite hard. Other thing of note with these guys, like I said, they're generally not regarded as like good eating fish generally. So they're a great game fish or a great, I guess, sport fish in my opinion. I don't know if I've ever caught one less than probably 25 inches long. They seems like it's hard to find little ones, but every time I catch one, it seems like they're big and they put up a good fight. Like I said, they're generally not regarded as particularly good for eating. I know some people smoke them. So rather than doing like a traditional sort of like filleting them and cooking the fillets and eating them, people will instead cut them into pieces and smoke the meat, and apparently that's pretty good. Never tried it myself, can't speak to it, but apparently that's pretty good. One thing of note with these guys, though, is that they are big time aggregators of mercury in their system. The way that they feed and the amount of like other fish that they're eating makes it so that these guys probably aggregate more mercury in them than maybe any other fish in Minnesota. And so if you're going to eat these guys, very much do it in moderation for that reason. So, I mean, treat it the same way that you would, I guess, like a northern or muskie, that, other big, long-lived predatory eating other fish types of fish. They all aggregate a lot of mercury into them. It's just sort of the nature of being a fish that has to deal with human runoff in your water systems. But yeah, dogfish, or bowfin, I keep calling them dogfish. I grew up calling them dogfish. I call them bowfin now because that's the actual name for them, but a lot of people call them dogfish. Like I said, limit your intake on them for sure if you do decide that you want to try and eat these guys. Gar. Alright, so gar are a group of fishes where there's a bunch of different species of them. Bowfin are literally, I think, the only species in their family. There used to be more fish like bowfin, but they mostly have gone extinct, and bowfin are sort of just the last one. Oh, I forgot one thing about bowfin, actually. One really weird thing about them. So just some fun bowfin facts. Like I said, they're one of my favorite fish because I love fishing for them, but they're also just really weird fish. Like I said, they're sort of the last of a lineage that has basically entirely died out. And so some sort of weird niche stuff that you have of them, like one of the ways that you're going to see bowfin, if you spend time fishing like in lakes around Minnesota, you'll probably see a lot more bowfin than you're actually going to catch. And that's because you'll notice they have this habit where they will come to the surface, just very briefly, just come to the surface, flip down and go down, flip over and go back down underwater, down to the bottom. And what they're doing when they're doing that is they're taking gulps of air. And so they have sort of a different type of swim bladder than what teleosts have, basically, where they have a really unique respiratory system where they can actually breathe both air and water, like water primarily, but they can breathe just normal air to a limited degree, to the point where, like, as long as they stay wet, they can functionally like live out of water almost indefinitely. Like they don't need to actually like have water be passing by their gills. As long as their body is staying moist, they can live basically forever. You'll hear stories about like flooding happening and people like finding them just like living in puddles basically afterwards, like weeks later. And so that's one thing I guess to note about them is, again, people will a lot of times like target these guys when they catch them, just be like, oh, throw it on the shore or whatever. If you're trying to kill them by throwing them on the shore, you're probably not going to succeed in that. They'll probably find their way back to the lake before they actually die. As I said, I don't endorse killing them, but even if you're trying to do it that way, like, probably didn't work. They also, like, as I understand it, can't do the same type of, like, gas exchange sort of inflation and deflation of their swim bladder. So like the way a lot of fish sort of maintain buoyancy and are able to like adjust their depth in the water is they're able to move gas in and out of their swim bladder while they're underwater to like inflate it or deflate it. And like I said, that helps them maintain their buoyancy in the water. These guys can't do that as I understand it. So one of the things that they're doing when they're coming up and taking that gulp of air is basically reinflating their swim bladder, and then when they're underwater they sort of deflate it over time, either using it for oxygen or just using it for buoyancy stuff, and then as I said, we'll come up and reinflate it periodically, and because of that, like, they're able to live in much lower oxygen concentrations than a lot of other fish are. So like I said, this is an example of why, like I said, when people are actually like targeting them, a lot of times where they'll go are these really like shallow, mucky, swampy areas that are, is it less desirable for a lot of fish because the O2 concentrations are lower. Probably also contributes to their tendency to be considered kind of a dirty fish, is that you find them in sort of conditions that generally wouldn't be considered very desirable. So a lot of commonality with like catfish, basically, which is probably why people call them dogfish, is because they functionally in so many ways are very similar to catfish. Okay, the gar. And like I said, there's a bunch of different types of gars, like all around, mostly the North America. I think there's a couple over in Europe. But predominantly a North American group of fishes. Been around in pretty similar type of form for, 100+ million years at this point, without changing a whole lot. And again, a non-teleosed fish, so they don't have a jaw that can project, but they do have still a pretty like distinctive mouth. And sort of your tendency, like your trend that you see sort of across all the different species of gar, is this like very long, narrow snout to varying degrees. The two species that we have in Minnesota are the long-nosed gar and the short-nosed gar. Probably the most famous member of this species is probably the alligator gar, which doesn't make it this far north. They, are sort of Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, sort of south middle part of the country is where you generally associate those guys as being. And so we have two smaller species up here. And so the long-nosed gar is pretty substantially bigger than the short-nose. The long-nose, I want to say the state record was like 14 pounds or something like that, whereas the short-nose, it was like 4. Don't quote me on either of those numbers, but they're close-ish to being correct. And the tendency with both of these guys is we don't really see them up around Bemidji area. We don't get them in the northern part of the state, really. The long-nosed gar, you really only see like way in the southeast part of the state. And there's been a couple of species that we've talked about that you see like exclusively way in the southeast part of the state. And that's just because they're in like, that's where the Mississippi River is as it's leaving Minnesota. And so you'll get some stuff that, will have a range within the Mississippi River that, gets up to, just south of the cities and then doesn't make it further north past the cities, basically. Long-nosed gar are a great example of that, where, like I said, they're in a body of water that extends all the way up to Bemidji, but the documentation of them getting this far up north just isn't there. Short-nosed gar, you can find kind of throughout the whole southern half of the state. Once you start getting south of Lake Mille Lacs, you can pretty much find them all over the place down there. They're not like common, but the range is all of that. And the way you can tell them apart, like I said, the long-nosed gar, like, on average, are going to be pretty substantially bigger. I don't have a picture of both of them up here, so this one is a short-nosed gar that you're seeing in my image here. They're the, like I said, the one that has the bigger range in Minnesota. And the biggest, like, easiest way to tell them apart is long-nosed gar they have spots all over their side, whereas the long-nosed or the short-nosed gar don't have any of that. They usually have just sort of the solid color, sort of metallic-y sheen to their side. They have a few spots that you'll see on the fins that are sort of a similar pattern to what you'd see in the long-nosed gar. But as far as like the actual like whole side of the thing, if it doesn't have spots, it's probably a short nose. If it has spots, it's probably a long nose. Long-nosed gar, as you would expect, also has a much longer, narrower nose as well. And as far as fishing for these guys, it's weird. I personally have never fished for gar. I'm not even 100% if I've ever even caught a gar. I said we lived in South Carolina for a while when I was a kid, and we did a lot of fishing down there, and I caught some weird stuff. I don't remember if I ever specifically ever caught any types of gar while I was down there, even though I know they were around down there, much more commonly than they are in Minnesota. But the way people generally do it is sort of a unique thing where they'll do what's called sight fishing. And so basically what you're doing with sight fishing is you're going out in your boat and you're moving around very slowly. So people are usually just like dropping their trolling motor around and sort of futzing around. And the thing about gar is you can a lot of times find them very close to the surface. They'll sit there, and a lot of times they'll even just like have like their backs under the water or sticking out of the water. So you can see them, and if you see that log sitting up near the surface, and people will do this for muskies as well. Muskies sort of have a very similar tendency to kind of just hang out right at the surface of the water. But for gar, they're sort of notorious for this, kind of across the board for all the different types of species. They all sort of do this, where they'll hang out sort of right at the top of the water, their backs up out of the water. Basically, you happen to spot one, you throw a bait past it, and then try and drag it past. So generally what you're trying to do is find one, see it from a distance, cast ahead of it, and then drag your bait sort of into it. Because they are sort of notoriously like not super like aggressive, like snappy hunters. They like to follow their prey around for a long time. They sort of have this perception of like trying to be very sneaky all the time for like how big of a fish they are. Again, it's sort of folk wisdom a lot of the times when we're talking about how you're actually fishing for these guys. That doesn't necessarily always translate directly to science, but so as I said, I don't have a lot of actual history fishing for gar, so this is sort of the wisdom that I was able to glean from the little bit of research I was doing on it. As I said, they have this reputation for sort of trying to be sneaky and sort of staying very close to the surface and stalking baits for a really long time. So it's a very like slow sort of let them keep up with it, and eventually they'll grab onto it. Surface bite very much is sort of what they're associated with, and a daytime bite, because again, you're looking for them by just like trying to see them on the surface. Also very much associated with like moving water, so areas where like rivers and streams are entering lakes is sort of a spot you associate them with. You associate them with like being on the backsides of dams a lot of the time. And so again, the idea is basically stuff is getting like swept into them more so than they're actually like going around hunting stuff. So they have this reputation for being sort of lazy as well. They're out there sort of just basking in the sunlight, waiting for food to fall into their mouth is sort of the reputation that they have. And so a lot of the wisdom for fishing for them seems to try and replicate that.
Bitch in the dark. It's not recording well.
Right. And so the last of the species that we are going to be talking about relatively heavily in this is the lake sturgeon, of course. Fun one of my favorites, probably the one I have the most, of this group at least, the most experience fishing for myself, at least directly fishing for it. Really fun species because this is the literal largest fish that we have in Minnesota. It is not unheard of for these guys to get well over 100 pounds. I think the state record is like 150, but the world record is like 200 plus. species that can live, the females can live to be well over 100 years old as well. You'll get stories of them reaching almost 200. Males don't live as long, they live to be maybe 60, 70 and don't get as big. But these big females, like I said, can live 150 plus years and get to be 200 pounds. Found throughout most of the bigger lakes throughout the northern half of the state. There's a handful of places that are really, really specifically well known for them. Lake of the Woods and the Rainy River going into it is like kind of the spot in Minnesota to go fishing for them. And the reason I decided to pick this group of fish for today's presentation is because like right now is when people are fishing for lake sturgeon specifically. The sturgeon excursion up at Lake of the Woods is happening, like, I guess more so like last weekend, but this weekend as well. And basically, it's hard to mistake a sturgeon for anything else. They're a very unique looking fish, but I guess just for the sake of doing our sort of outlining that we always do. Dark on top, grayish, almost black, some of them, but a lot of variation at some level of gray, dark versus light. Like I said, it tends to be darker. This one's pretty typical coloration wise, but then white on the bottom, or cream colored maybe on the bottom. Mouth on the underside, and I mentioned they have that mouth that can sort of project out underneath, because these guys are very, very much bottom feeders. So they have this really flat belly underneath, sort of torpedo shaped in the front and on top, but then very flat underneath, because these guys are basically just skimming around on the bottom. And basically how they find their food is you can see they have these little whiskers under here. These are called barbels. And so what they do is they take those barbels and they drag them all over the place. These guys basically never stop moving. They're just scooting around all the time. Like I said, they're like little Roombas basically going around on the bottom of the lake, or I guess very big Roombas. Dragging those barbels across stuff, and if they taste something that is not normal, they suck it up into their mouth. Is kind of the way they go. And they spend a lot of time just like sifting through gravel. They'll pick up, like I said, basically anything that registers to them as anything, and they'll at least give it a taste. Sift it through, they'll sort of cycle it through in their mouth, and they'll spit out, the sand and gravel and stuff and try and find whatever worthy food is in there. And so when you're fishing for them, again, you want to be fishing for them on the bottom. And so I said they have this mouth on the underside, and so they are very much sort of going around scavenging whatever they can find, whether it be live or not. They'll pick up pretty much anything. And so when you're actually fishing for them, you got to get your hook right down at the bottom. And so you're talking usually about very heavy sinkers, very big hooks as well, because these are big fish. And again, if you're using sinkers with things like night crawlers and stuff like that, one of the issues you're going to run into is other stuff getting on it before these sturgeon do. And so, yeah, you're trying to get down deep. You're usually talking, again, it depends on how you're trying to fish for them, what time of year and where, because they're in the lakes all the time, but they are very, very much associated with this April, sort of around Easter time type of bite. Because that's when they are coming back into the lakes from the rivers. So they live most of their life in the lake. They swim up the river to spawn, and then they come back out after they spawn. And generally when people are fishing for these guys, it is when they are coming back from the rivers into the lakes to, post spawning, basically. And so you're generally hitting them, like I said, in the mouth of a river, or in a river, or, like I said, around where a river is entering a lake. A lot of times you're talking 20, 30 feet of water, I guess in my experience is usually sort of what you're looking for. Moving water, and then you're just sitting stuff on the bottom and, like I said, hoping they drift over the top of it. Is, I guess, generally the thing. And when you're fighting these guys, this is the part of them that has always been very enchanting to me, is I really enjoy the fight that these guys provide, because it's even the little ones are very, very good at just swimming downwards basically. And there's, I guess in my mind, always been very much this mystique about them of there's a lot of the times when you'll catch them and you'll be fighting them for a little while, and then they'll snap your line and you'll never see it. And like I said, I love that mystique of being oh, that was probably the one. That one was the state record. That one was the world record, but we'll never know. Because like I said, you're fishing in 30 feet of moving water. These fish can get very big. You're using very big, heavy tackle. And like I said, they're really, really strong when it comes to swimming downwards. And we talked a little bit about tails earlier when we were talking about the bowfin. I just want to draw a little attention here to the tail. You see it on that one? Not really, not in the picture. I have a mounted lake sturgeon here, and it's not the prettiest mount in the world, but it's got the one feature that I really care to talk about. I used the word earlier, heterocaudal. And so what a heterocaudal tail is a tail that sort of has two halves. So there's a top part and a bottom part. And in a heterocaudal tail, those two halves are different lengths is what it means. And so with sturgeon, you'll see the top half of the tail is much longer than the bottom half is. And so what that means is that when this fish sort of swings its tail, the direction it gets pushed is down. And so these guys, like I said, pretty much never want to be like up near the surface. Like you'll see them every once in a while come up and like take a gulp of air too, kind of similar to the way the bowfin do. But these guys want to spend pretty much all their time down at the bottom of the lake. And so whenever they are swinging their tail is basically pushing down and keeping them down at the bottom. So like I said, they're going around, and this guy doesn't have his barbels, this taxidermy. But you can see the mouth underneath there. And so they'll drag those barbels around, they'll drag it over something, and they'll slurp it up. And like I said, spend 200 years doing that. The other sort of really distinctive feature about these guys is the scoots. And scoots is a word you've maybe heard before, maybe haven't. There's a lot of stuff that gets called scoot. A scoot is basically like any type of like armor plating that an animal will have. And so you can see like with this one, it has all these things down the side, these spots. And I'll tell you on this one, these are kind of sharp. And you'll find that is true with a little bit smaller sturgeon, where they have scoots that are not just hard, but actually have like pokies on them that can be kind of uncomfortable, and they get basically progressively less pokey the bigger they get. And so I was talking to one of the other staff here before I was getting ready for the show, and I was like, I don't know why this sturgeon would have gotten mounted. It's like not a particularly like large sturgeon. It is honestly smaller than most probably. And that's one of the things that's sort of evidenced by the fact that like, hey, it still has pokey scoots on it. Because when you catch the really big ones, these are mostly smoothed out. They're still there, like you can still see them, the shape of them. But they don't have the poke on them anymore. They just sort of are little hard spots that run all the way down the side. But like I said, when they're really little, like when you catch the itty bitty, sub 20-inch ones, they're like little porcupines when you pull them out. You got to be careful, like holding onto them, because they will genuinely poke you. And you can see the scoots also on the ones in here. These are a little bit bigger ones, and you can see where they have the scoots, but they don't necessarily have the like spikes that are sticking out of them still. Yeah, that's fishing for sturgeon. And again, pretty heavily regulated species in Minnesota. There is a specific season for them. You are only allowed to, I think, keep one sturgeon per year. You have to buy a special tag for them. And like I said, it's one tag per person. You can't, buy... You can't use your tag for somebody else's fish. It has to be your fish that you catch. You can use your one tag for it, and you can keep one a year. And lake sturgeon are to a point where they have a healthy-ish population in Minnesota at this point, which is why there is, a way to facilitate people keeping any of them. But go back even just like a couple decades, and they were very nearly extinct in this state. They're a great example of a species that has really benefited from relatively modern conservation efforts, because they are a fish that used to be all over the place in this state, and then, like I said, nearly got completely extirpated, nearly got wiped out in the state, in really the entire upper Midwest in the early 1900s for a number of reasons. Again, they were considered kind of a pest fish because they're so big they would break fishing nets. They ran through them. The other thing that they got used for a long time was, as sort of industrialization was happening in the Midwest, materials from sturgeon got used in a lot of ways there. Their meat is very greasy, and so sturgeon oil was used as a lubricant in a lot of machinery in a lot of those early 1900s factories. Their skin actually makes a leather that was considered to be pretty good quality as far as like making like belts for machinery. So they got harvested a lot for that. There was a weird stretch of time actually where their eyeballs, for whatever reason, were considered to be good cores for baseballs. And so there's a stretch of time in the like mid 1800s up until the like early-ish 1900s where sturgeon eyeballs were used as the cores of baseballs. So there's been a number of reasons that these guys have gotten harvested really heavily over the years. I said to a point where they were, by the mid 1900s, almost completely wiped out in the state, and over the last several decades, really committed conservation efforts have gotten them back to a pretty good spot. And that's not even talking about the caviar trade. Lake sturgeon, generally not considered to be like the highest quality caviar out there, but because they are like the sturgeon that has the biggest footprint in North America, they still were pretty heavily harvested for their caviar at one point, which caviar is a salty snack that is made of fish eggs, predominantly sturgeon eggs. Paddlefish, caviar, also very much a thing as well. And so fish that get targeted for their caviar tend to not do so hot. They tend to get harvested really heavily and really irresponsibly. And so a lot of sturgeon species around the world are in really dire times as far as their population numbers. There's something like 28 species of sturgeon in the world or something like that, and like 24 of them are considered to be endangered at least, if not critically endangered. And so, as far as sturgeon go, lake sturgeon are in a pretty good spot, to the point where Minnesota does actually allow people to keep one every year. But they're a great example of like why we need people to be good stewards and actually like care about maintaining these environments, because they came very close to being wiped out. And like I said, they're a great fish as far as both their usefulness in the ecosystem, but also even just as like for their like human usage. And even for me as somebody who's predominantly a recreational fisherman, like I said, one of my favorite species. It would be unfortunate if they weren't around to continue being enjoyed in that way. And so, like I said, our takeaway message for all this is always that we want to remember that the reason we're learning about these species, the reason that we want people to go out and participate in things like fishing, is because it encourages people to be good stewards of the environment and ensure that these species get to continue existing and keep being enjoyed by people for generations to come. That was my last slide for today. I got a birthday party I gotta go attend to in a little bit here. Let's see, what species are we gonna talk about next week? How about we'll talk catfishes and things like that next week. We talked a little bit about barbels this week. I mentioned them when I was talking about the bowfin, how they're kind of similar in a lot of ways to catfish. But, like I said, with that, gotta find a good height here to be. I think we'll call that a wrap for our show today. Thank you guys in our online audience watching. Thank the couple of people who passed by while I was talking here in person. This video will be up on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook and all that if you want to go back and review anything. But yeah, we'll talk catfish and bullheads next week. I think that'll be a good through line for this. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next week.